At any rate, may I start please by thanking Annette for co-hosting and for helping me, and the two of us have been working on the program committee. I thank Brad Keyes for all of his patience with getting us up to speed on the technology part. He's a wonderful teacher. And then Kay Westcott, Gardner Westcott, for her help in finding pictures and sorting things out. There are many times that she would minimize something for me or maximize it, and it was great. And then of course Jane Siaka, who's my go-to person for a little fact that I can't remember or figure out. As we said in the description for the program, about 35 years ago, with the help of two of our most prestigious historians, Helen Emery, who wrote the book, The History of Wayland, the Puritan Village Evolves, and Joe Gessel, who was the curator for a long time for the Historical Society. And I presented a similar program with historic photographs and a large collection of slides that had been given to the Wayland Historical Society. They were the slides of Margaret Morrill. We will talk about her off and on throughout this presentation. She lived in Cochituate and all her life, and was the granddaughter of and the grandniece of the Bents who started the shoe factories there, which we'll be looking at. Today we're looking at similar views that we looked at in 35 years ago. And I do have to say that almost all of the historic photographs that I've used today are in the collection of the Wayland Historical Society. And we're so fortunate to have a huge collection of, huge number of photographs that were done by Alfred Wayland Cutting, and I'll say more about him as we go through. Another source for today's talk is Joseph Seabury's 1916 book called New Homes Under Old Roofs, in which he explores renovations of old houses, including 6 in Wayland. Most of them are all the outskirts of Boston, but there are 6 from Wayland. And so I'm going to start there. So we're going to look at changes that come from remodeling and updating, change in paint color, the moving of buildings within Wayland, outside of Wayland, and demolition, which often results in new construction. Oops, it's not advancing for me. There we go. So the first one is the Bennett house, which is on Boston Post Road, and you all pass it regularly and probably don't even know it because it's hiding behind the gas station at the top of Plain Road and where Old Connecticut Path comes out. And of course, I do pass that gas station every day to go anywhere, and I couldn't tell you what kind of gas it is because I've never bought my gas there, I guess. It used to be an Exxon. I think it might be a Shell now. Doesn't matter. The house itself was built in 1774 by William Barker, who was one of the signers of the petition to separate the two towns, Sudbury and East Sudbury, so that we had our own town, which eventually became Wayland. That petition was in 1780. And he was also a fence viewer, pretty important job at that time. We still have fence viewers, but we probably don't do a lot of fence viewing. After Barker, there were several owners before the Bennetts, but it was the Theodore Wilbur Bennetts, including Mrs. Bennett, who was named Anna, who made the changes to this property and made it relatively famous in terms of our local history. She was the daughter of Judge Edward Mellen. This was a typical federal building with center chimney and hipped roof, 5 bays across. That's the 5 openings, 5 windows on the second story, and 5 openings, the center entrance and the 2 windows on each side on the first story. So Seabury, in all of his houses that he looks at, shows the before and then the after. And so the before picture here was not taken in 1774, obviously. It was taken in the 1890s or before the 1890s The remodeling happened in 1894 and 1899. The Bennetts at that time needed additional space, apparently, even though Mr. Bennett died in 1899, but at least 3 children were living at home through the early 1900s. So the addition was a replica of the original building with end chimneys and a hipped roof. And the family also wanted a music room, which they included in that. And they enclosed the portico, the entrance to the main block, and they have half side lights on that enclosed entry now. So today, the building is, as I said, behind the gas station on Route 20, and they only preserved the addition, the 1894 addition, not the original building. That went by the wayside. So what we have here is the Colonial Revival building that is not the original building, but is, of the same style and retaining some part of the building. The next one is the Nathan Glezen House, only named that because he built it, but it's actually better known to us as the Abel Glezen House, who lived in it from he lived in it for a long time, but he was not an adult until the 1820s. It was built by Nathan Glezen, as I said. He was the son of Phineas Glezen, who had a wonderful house farther west on Glezen Lane. And the name is spelled Gleason in many records, and then eventually Glezen. And so I've put them both here, and I've seen them in both spellings. In 1804, Nathan had bought the old training field, 9 or 10 acres in the central portion of the 18th century Abel Glezen's farm. And so this house was built by Nathan. It passed to Reuben and Polly Glezen, and Reuben died in 1825, and eventually Abel, his son, born in 1803, was the proprietor of the property. It was one of the only brick houses in Wayland, 4 rooms, 5 bays across under the hipped roof with end chimneys. The remodeled version in Seabury's book, and you will see that he shows you a picture of before and then after. The remodeling was about 1900 with a large 2-story library wing just to the west of the main block, and it was built by the Pattersons, who owned it at that time. And there was also a wing to the north. The west library wing, it's just a much larger house, as you can see here, but you can track it with the main block, the hipped roof, the chimneys that were on either end chimneys. And then we go to the present day photograph, is the colored photograph on the left of your screen. And the west wing was demolished in about 1939 to 1940. And the north wing was relocated as a separate dwelling just east of the Abel Glezen house, right on the bend of Training Field Road and Glezen Lane. And it's the picture in the bottom right-hand side. The Pattersons, Mike Patterson, who lives in town, grew up in the north wing, and does have some wonderful photographs, which I look forward to seeing, of the library, because apparently it was quite elaborate and beautiful. Next is the Timothy Coughlin house on Glezen Lane, on the east end of Glezen Lane. It's named after Timothy Coughlin, who was a later owner. He bought it he lived there from 1874. It started as a small workers' house built in circa 1810 on the farm of Samuel Griffin. The Samuel Griffin house is farther west on Glezen Lane today. So this house, maybe most of you know it today, is the Beard House, where Molly and John Beard live and have lived for a very long time. the house was remodeled in 1930 with a large rear L that incorporated the little one-story rear L that you can see in the left-hand picture, and made it into a salt box, then a dining room wing on the east side, and the pergolas extending westerly and southerly. So you can see these porches that are sticking out of the front of the house, and then on the part that is facing you. And the photograph, both photographs actually, are taken from Hazelbrook Road. And the one that has the steps in it, that is the remodeled version, those steps are still right there. And I would have loved to have taken the photograph that I took of the house from those, but there's lots of vegetation in the way. So I had to step in a little bit to see the existing house. So the existing house today, as we see it, is changed in color. It's no longer white, no longer has shutters, and it is the beige color that is on the bottom right of your screen. And the other photograph, the upper right, just shows it in the earlier period. I actually forgot to ask Molly the date for that, but I would say that it's probably the 60s or 70s. And the house, as you can see, has shutters that time. The dining room was extended, as we said, in 1913. Then a second story was added at a later date to the dining room addition. And then the pergola was enclosed to be part of the dining room, as very evident in the present day photograph. The next one is the Stone-Sears house. Stone-Sears house on Pelham Island Road. It was built in circa 1715 by Samuel Stone on what he considered the island near to the pond. That's the way it was described. It's a typical second period or Georgian plan which is unadorned, and a central chimney, pediment over the door, and unlandscaped. And I point those out because those are features that you would find for all of these places, because they were working farms. I mean, people didn't have time to elaborate their architecture or their landscape. That changed for sure. In 1884 and 89, the Edwin Buckingham had purchased the property and remodeled it, and it's an example of early preservation. He brought fragments of the Oliver Wendell Holmes house in Cambridge to Wayland, such as that you can see in the right-hand picture, the door surround with the fluted pilasters, the dental pediment, the dental blocks along the top of the pediment, the bottom of the pediment, and then the balustrade that you see between the two dormers, and then the flanking piazzas on each side of the house, the porches or piazzas as they were called then, and also interior paneling. This was pretty irregular to find this high level of sophistication of architectural detail in Wayland, but it is an influence of the summer residents that once the railroad went through in 1881, people started buying houses, old farmhouses in Wayland, and coming here for the summer or for a respite or whatever. I'm not sure exactly what their regularity was in their arriving, but the Buckinghams and the Sears were summer residents before they became full-time residences. And one of the Sears, Edmund Sears, grandson of the minister, Edmund Sears, married Buckingham's daughter. And so they were eventually the owners and residents of this house until only the, I think, 80s or 90s, 1980s or 90s. It was under Sears proprietorship. So then let's look at the present house today. The balustrade between the dormers is gone. It's still a center chimney. You can see the piazza is a little bit better here. And unfortunately, the picture of the interior paneling is not a very good one. I apologize for that. but there is wonderful paneling that all came from the Oliver Wendell Holmes house. And at that time, it was very popular to take fragments of houses that were being torn down and reusing them in other places. And of course, it's still popular today, I suppose. The next one is the Isaac Carver House. This also was a summer residence at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. It is on Old Connecticut Path. More recently, it was the MacArthurs, for those of you who have lived in Wayland for quite a while. And before that, it was Wilcox. It was built about 1800, replacing a 1740s house that was on this site. Seabury talks about this house as having, quote, I quote him, suffered the usual architectural disfigurements common to many old houses, a coat of drab paint, a Victorian porch, and the original small pane windows removed to the chicken house. Remember, Seabury was writing in the early 20th century, his book, and he lived here. And so he did the remodeling of this particular house. Let me see, I'm sorry. So we see that the windows on the left-hand side is not actually the house that was built. It is the house that was built, but it's not exactly like that. It had already been updated in the 1880s with the attributes that were popular at the time, particularly the open porch that is in the Italianate style here, and then the large pane windows, the 2 lights over 2 lights to let in more light, obviously. Was the reason that was done. So that was apparently done in the 1880s. Then Seabury came along and in 1911 remodeled it with the use of an architect's plans. The windows were returned to the 6 over 6 lights. The broad piazzas were added. There was one to the west, as you see here, and the chimney was enlarged above the roof line, the chimneys. There were 2 chimneys on this, and painted as well. A library L was added to the rear, and the what he considered the Victorian porch was removed from the entry. And so today it still retains what Seabury did in the 1911 renovation of the house. The next one is Reeves Tavern, next door to the Carver house that we just looked at. It's named for the tavern keeper, and here was Jacob and Abigail Reeves, lived here from 1762 when they purchased the property. Seabury says that the house was built in 1715. That's only true of 2 rooms, the complete east end with there are 2 windows, one up and one down, that show the original house. Jacob Reeves built the rest of it, which is to be the tavern, which is the next 5 windows that we can actually see in the slides here. It's a little bit non-traditional because most Georgian and federal houses are very symmetrical, and so they have 2 windows on each side of a center entry. Reeves Tavern has 3 windows to the east of the entry and 2 to the west, because of that 1-room house that existed prior to his arriving. Seabury notes that it was restored in 1908, and in the description, he says that when the original built windows are reproduced and reinstated, the restoration will be complete. So you see that Seabury's after photograph is before the final restoration, because the windows now are the 6 over 9 that you see in the first photograph on the left, which was taken before 1875, because we actually have a photograph of the late 19th century that shows really what the Hubbards were purchasing. This house was owned by 5 generations of Reeves until 1906, and then the Hubbards bought it in 1906 and lived here for 2 generations until our family purchased it, the Schulers. So here we have today, just to be a little bit confusing, what the Seabury was actually seeing for the first building was the Reeves updating that you see on the left, the late 19th century. That's when the windows had been changed to the 2/2, just as the Seabury's house. But mind you, Seabury came to Wayland probably when this renovation had already been complete, except for the windows. And so he did not see that what they were doing, that they had the Italianate door hood. It was very, it had been Victorianized, if you want to say that. So the after photograph, which was on the before slide, more closely resembles what is today, but with the windows replaced. And when we came here, the windows, this is what we purchased, a house that you see today, except it was white with shutters, as you can see there, on the right, white with shutters. And we changed it to the later color and removed the shutters. Most 18th century houses and early 19th century houses, particularly not in the city, were either yellow ochre or red iron oxide. Those were the 2 paint colors that were available, that were less expensive than other pigments. And so that's why most houses are of those colors. And that's why we chose this color for this house. So now we go to Cochituate, and we have the bird's eye view of Cochituate, which is a fantastic lithograph that we are so blessed with because we really can identify buildings. They were incredibly accurate. And here's where I really needed Kay Gardner Westcott to help me cut out this one piece for this slide so that you could see it. But it does cover all of Cochituate. And if you haven't seen it, a big version of it, definitely explore and find a large version so you can really zero in on different properties. I decided to number the 4 corners of the intersection. This is the intersection of Main Street, which is running north-south diagonally through this slide, and Commonwealth Road, which was Lake Street at the time, which is the horizontal road. So on the southwest corner, we have the Bent Shoe Factory, and that's where Starbucks is today. On the southeast corner, we have the William Bent House. This is where Margaret Morrow lived her life until her death. And that's today where the Pharmacy and Grill 110 is. On the northwest corner, you see there the Bryant Block, which was a commercial block, and there's all commercial buildings going up Main Street. And eventually the Bryant Block was also a pharmacy, and in the second half of the 20th century, it was Johnson's Pharmacy, which many people may remember. And today it's the Middlesex Bank and the post office. And on the northeast side, we had the James Madison Bent House, and I did not find a photograph that was that would really give you any sense of it, of that particular house. Therefore, I just used the lithograph that you have to look at to understand what was that house. It's where TD North Bank is today. The transportation at this time, there were horse cars that ran from Natick to Lyons Corner. Lyons Corner we'll look at in a second, which is the intersection of West Plain and East Plain Street with Main Street. The stables were in Cochituate, where the Cochituate Fire Station is today. And it was in 1892 that the Natick and Cochituate Street Railway began electrifying the route, but not all the way to Wayland Center. That didn't happen until 1899. I show you this just so you can see where the tracks were, or I mentioned that, I should say. So here's the Bent Shoe Factory. We have 3 versions of it in photographs. As I said, it's on the corner of Commonwealth and Main Street. It began in, or the business began in William Bennett's house across Main Street. And by the 1850s, he and his brother, James Madison Bent, had begun to build the factory on this southwest corner. James Madison Bent had a store in the if you look at the left slide, and you have three parts to the main building. You have a 4-story Greek Revival building with large columns. Then you have this transition in between the gallery, and then you have a 5-bay, what looks like a house, a 2.5-story house on the right side end. That was where his store was. And so then they built this Greek Revival 4-story with the monumental columns south of the shop, and then eventually connected them. In 1878, additions were made to the 4-story structure as well, and turning the roof into the mansard roof, which we're going to look at as we go through, because there are many mansard roofs. It was a very popular form in Cochituate. And they turned the store so that the gable end was facing in the same direction as the original building, facing across Main Street rather than across Commonwealth Road. Then in 1880s, it was enlarged again to be a really true factory building as we would consider it today, with everything filled in. The gallery was filled in, and everything was continuous with the mansard roof part of the building, which is the original part, not with a mansard roof. It had a Greek Revival, and then it got the mansard roof. And today it's the Starbucks corner, as you know. I didn't make pictures of all of the replacements, but that one was just wanted to orient you. On the other corner, the southeast corner, was the William Benn house. I'm just showing you this so you can see a good picture of that house. It was it was built in 1775, and it was a typical Georgian house that definitely had changes made to it throughout its lifetime, including enclosing part of the porch, probably adding part of the porch, and there are also brackets on the side of the dormers. That was not part of the 1775 part. But William Bent, one of the proprietors and founders of the William Bent and James Madison Bent shoe factory, lived here, and then eventually Margaret Morrow lived here. On the bottom right, with a 3 on it, is the Bryant block that I mentioned before, is on the northwest corner where the Today's Bank and Post Office are. And that was a commercial block, as I mentioned before. So back to those mansard roofs. These are 3 buildings that are no longer with us. The first is the Cochituate Engine House on the left. It was built on Main Street and then moved around to Harrison by 1887, because it's on Harrison Avenue in the lithograph that we looked at before. Its location was pretty much the back of the parking lot if you went in that entrance to the Community Methodist Church, right back there on that side. The upper right is the Academy. This is the first Cochituate school. It was built in 1873, and it was demolished in about 1910 when the new school was built on the same site. This one had been built by Orrin Harris, who built many buildings in Cochituate, and it was for primary and intermediate grades. And then on the lower right, you have the Clarence Williams store on Main Street. It was a grocery store, and that came down when a lot of the buildings along Main Street, at the time of the bank and the changes along Main Street were being had. Other buildings that have not been demolished that we've been able to preserve and have been saved from in Cochituate that also have the mansard roof. The first one in the upper left is the Damon Griffin House. Was built by George Alvin Damon and Noble C. Griffin. It was first a boarding house. And then in 1882, Damon lived here. He died in 1885, and the house was sold to Griffin, to Wallace Griffin, brother of Noble Griffin. The Griffins were successful shoe factory owners, and they had bought many houses in the area. Also, this now is was eventually, I thought it was really interesting. It became a funeral home as early as 1932. And then, of course, we all knew it as Waterman's Funeral Home by 1961. And now it's condominiums. The Charles Damon House was built in circa 1870. It also may have been built for George Alvin Damon may have built this for his brother, and it's not dissimilar to the house that he built above that you see here. The Charles Damon House is on Damon Street, and it's on the south side of Damon Street. So the left if you're going down from Main Street. And then on Harrison Avenue is the Albert Goodnow House, a simple mansard cottage, we call it that, rather than a second empire with the two-story houses. It was built sometime around 1870 to 1875, and Goodnow worked in the Bent shoe factory. That house was quite derelict and was restored in, I would say, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Other mansard roof, back to the Cochituate School, which we saw before in a slide. The academy existed from 1873 to 1911, and then was replaced by the Cochituate School that we know today. That's the Cochituate Village Apartments. And again, it's interesting to see the brick coming into play. Lyons Corner. This was named for, it's at West Plain and Main Streets is the corner that we're focusing on, where the CVS is today. The trolley went this far. You can see the trolley in the photograph on the bottom. This was so named for the shoe shop factory and shoe shop and factory that were on the southwest corner where the gas station was, and in front of the ball field. On the northwest corner, where the CVS is now, there was the Knights of Columbus, established in 1880s, and they built this building in 1887 that you see on the bottom slide on the left. When they settled, they were formed when they settled a strike at Bent Shoe Factory in 1883. This building that they built in 1887 became the first public hall in Cochituate. The first floor was a meat market and general store, and then a banquet hall on the first floor, and then behind, up above on the main hall was a second floor, was the Knights of Columbus room that they used for their meetings, and also the Lasters Union meetings were here, and entertainment as well. As the shoe industry ended, they rented it to the Patrons of Husbandry, or the Grange organization. And after World War I, the American Legion used the same building, this two-story building that we see on the left. But then there was a spectacular fire in 1925, at which time immediately the American Legion was able to rebuild their building. And it was a low colonial revival yellow brick building. In 1972, it became Finnerty's Restaurant, which some of us know, 1972 until 2015, at which time it was demolished and eventually became the CVS parking lot. I think it's interesting to see the tree, the birch tree that survived the transition. Main Street, looking north, from Commonwealth Road, is again the same block that we talked about before, the Bryant block. If you see the awning, just beyond the awning is that Williams grocery store, and then other buildings as you march up the street. The red arrow is there to point to the two buildings that remain on this streetscape that are from the late 19th century, early 20th century. And they are in the photograph on the right. And I think you can see the form of the straight front with a false front roof line for the first building, and then the gable roof of the second building. They're quite different because all their windows have been changed, and also they have aluminum siding or some sort of synthetic siding rather than the wood clapboards. So the Episcopal Methodist Society was formed in the late in the 1860s, and I'm sorry, and they built their first church here in 1868 on a lot that they purchased from Charles Damon. Remember I mentioned that Charles Damon house, which was not the house that you see in the background on the left, but rather across the street from that house. He had a very large lot here. So he sold this to the Episcopal Methodist Society for their church. In 1873, the pointed spire was added to the building, hence the date on the photograph that shows you that this was taken between 1873 and then 1896, when the major renovation was performed. That included a bell tower, a three-stage bell tower that you see on the left, and a new projecting front piece where the window that was on the main block projected out and was moved out to the front of the building. And the window was donated by the Masons of Wayland and North Natick. The other thing that I want to point out about this is the town clock was put into the tower, and the town clock, the town paid the church $50 a year to have the town clock there. And it was a very important feature of the workings of a densely developed village. The town clock for Wayland Center is in the First Parish Church tower. In 1952, the church, as we see it today, added the 7 classroom addition, and I think there have been other additions as well, but that was the major change to the main facade. But you can see all of the features here, and I do have to note that we all helped pay for the restoration of the clock with community preservation funds a couple of years ago, and all the workings were refabricated, and the clock does work today. St. Zepherin's had somewhat similar things going on, not being in the same building. Well, they're not in the same building. The Methodist church is in the same building. On the left, you see the Albert Dean House with a mansard roof, and the church, the first St. Zepherin's, built behind in 1889 to 1890. So in March of 1889, the parish bought the Albert Dean House from him to house the first priest. And then in August of 1899, they started to build the church that you see in the background there. The church remained there until the 1990s when it was demolished. And the photograph that you see on the right was taken in, I think in 1980. I can't remember exactly when I took that one, but it was sometime soon before it came down, and it wasn't being used very much at that time. I think it's interesting to point out that at the time, 20% of Cochituate population were French Canadian Catholics at the time that it was being built in 1890s, and the early services were in French. Here is the parish house that was built in about 1968. They demolished the Goulding House and built this. And of course, the construction of the main church building is to the left, you can see there. And the other one is gone. So up to Wayland Center, at the center, in the position of our present public safety building, we had the Pequod Inn, which later was known as the Wayland Inn. It was built in 1771 and demolished in 1928 on the corner of Cochituate Road and Boston Post Road. It was built by Elijah Bennett, who was a housewright and an inn holder. And he eventually lived next door, but that's another story. Until the mid 1800s, this was a stagecoach stop. And when the stagecoach ended, that really was a problem for this inn in terms of its future. In 1891, it had become known as the Wayland Inn. And by then we had the railroad, we had the trolley, and the stagecoach was defunct, totally defunct. In 1920, Edmund Sears, Walter Henderson, and Sidney Stone became the trustees of the Wayland House. They paid the taxes and agreed to demolish the inn to have a site for a town use. The demolition was in 1927, 28, and some of the paneling was taken by Stone to his house on Lincoln Road, and he built a big addition to his house, and all the paneling is in that room of the addition. And it's interesting to note that a new town hall that was eventually built here did not happen until 30 years later, 1957. So here we are on town buildings. Our first town building, as we all remember, was called the Townhouse. It was built in 1841. It's the fine Greek revival with monumental columns that we all know as Collins Market. It was a town hall and a library, and the post office was there for a short time as well. The second town hall for the town of Wayland was built in 1879, and it was demolished in 1957. It was a very large stick-style building with a tall corner tower on the site of the Grout Herd House. It was a town hall and the library until 1900, when our Romanesque library was built next door, just on the other side of the railroad tracks. The stick style was not very popular in Wayland. We don't see a lot of it in Wayland at all. In fact, I can't even think of an example. It was the point was to echo the workings or the makings of the building with the stick work, even though it was not structurally significant. So there was a lot of half timbering in places. There were pieces that here there are demarcations of the levels of the building, the first story, the second story, and then the top story. The third one was the 1957 low brick one-story town building on land that was made ready 30 years before, as I mentioned, and it was the town hall until 1978. Then it became the police and fire station until it was demolished for our present public safety building. The fourth town hall was our present town building, which we call town building instead of town hall. It was constructed in 1935 with the main part that has that cupola, and then it had additions in 1948 and 51. It's brick, as you can see, and it was constructed as a school in the colonial revival form. It was Charles M. Baker was the architect, and the local consulting architect was Frank Cooper, who lived up on Concord Road. As I said, it was first a high school. In 1960, it became a junior high school until 1972. Then it was renovated in 1978 for the town building that we see, and town and school administration. Nearby on the Mellen Law Office Green, we once had two other buildings. We had the Samuel Russell's Provisions. It faced Pelham Island Road in the late 1800s. It was built in, I think, about 1876, I think it was. This photograph is after 1928, because if you look in the background, you see the windmill that was at the Pequod House, Wayland Inn, but no Wayland Inn. That had been demolished in 1928. So that photograph is from that date or later. And you can also see the Mellen Law Office in the almost in the center of the Samuel Russell Provisions photograph. The H.F. Lee and Company was a general store also on Mellen Law Office Green. And it was, as I said, a general store, and it was demolished in the 1920s. And then, of course, we still have the Mellen Law Office Green, thankfully. Whoops, I'm sorry. The George Smith House was built in 1845, and the only reason I put it here is to show you the difference in colors and also vegetation. Look at the landscape around the it's obviously in the 1870s or 80s or 90s that the picture on the left is taken. And then in the 1970s, the building was red, as you see it there in the photograph on top. And today it's the gray color. But the same rhythm is recalled. It's a double entry. It was a two-family. And it was George Smith had his store in one part, and I shouldn't say a two-family, two units, if you will, has his store in one part and the residence in another part. As it is used today, when it was Lyons, Sherman and his wife lived upstairs, and she still does. And then the store was downstairs. And today it's offices and residence as well. Cochituate Road looking south from Boston Post Road, that's not supposed to say, south of the Boston Post Road, right? There are three buildings here that we all probably can identify, but we're going to talk about a little bit. The trolley, as I had said, came up this far at that time. You can see the tracks on the left of the photograph. So there's the church. The Congregational Church was built in 1835, the one that we see in the black and white photograph, which is a Alfred Wayland cutting photograph. And it burned in 1922. It was the old Trinitarian Congregational Church, if you will. A group of people in 1828 broke away from the town church as they were dissatisfied with the doctrine. And then it took them until 1835 to raise the funds to build this church and carriage sheds as well. As I said, it burned in 1922, and the new church was built immediately thereafter. So that is the first part of the building. And I didn't take the photograph from the same angle, which would have been probably a little more helpful for orientation, but I wanted to maximize the replacement church of 1922 that you see here with the same bell tower, but it's a little bit different. It's incorporated into the facade, but it's a 3-stage bell tower still, as was on the earlier building. The second building in that streetscape was the first Wayland High School, built in 1855 in the Italianate style. And in the by the late 1860s and 70s, there were many children that were going out of town for school. And so they decided to close it. So it was closed for a bit. And then in 1894, the Oddfellows Lodge of the International Order of Oddfellows, a fraternal organization, purchased the building, and they moved it a little bit north because it was farther south, because the town wanted to build a new high school. And that's the third building you see in the picture. But let's just look at these three first. The top picture is it was also taken by cutting, and you can see that the building was painted a different color with white trim, and it had shutters, green shutters probably, or black possibly, I don't know which. And the windows on the facade are boarded up or shuttered up. And we don't know the answer to that from the photograph. But when what we all remember and know is the building with those windows boarded up with the clapboards right straight through the openings. And again, community preservation funds were used to restore and replace all of the windows in the first high school, also known as the Oddfellows Hall. And so the final product is on the right, and they could have considered painting it a different color if they wanted to, but they didn't. They stuck with the white, which is fine. And that's what people would recognize. But the windows really do look so lovely now that they're back in the building, and the other ones are all restored. The center school was the building that was for which the first high school was moved a little bit north to make way for this building. It was built in 1896 as a high school in the classical revival style with a Palladian window. The funds were raised by wealthy Waylanders such as Francis Shaw. The building was demolished in 1976, and it's now Center School Park. Two dwellings on Cochituate Road that we've also lost recently are the 1903 William Sayard House Sayward House on the left. It was built by Everett Warren Small, known as Pop Small. He was a local builder, had an office on Boston Post Road. And in 1926, the house was sold to John and Edith Holt for $6,000. So I always think it's interesting to see what the price of things are. In 1954, it was purchased by Link and Ruth Heinrich, which many people probably remember or knew. And then in 1982, they sold it to the church, which used it as a rectory to the Trinitarian Congregational Church, used it as a rectory for a few years. The bottom photograph in the right corner is the Frank Pouslin House. It was built sometime around 1903, and I really just feature this because our George Lewis grew up here. His parents had purchased it. His parents, George W. Lewis and Alice Lewis, purchased it in 1923, which was just in time for his birth. And he grew up here and remembered it fondly. It was sold to the church in 1973. Now to the Grout Hurd House. Now we're into moving houses. This house was named for the 18th and 19th century occupants. The first part was built in about 1740, close to the time of the marriage of Jonathan Grout in 1743. was probably a 4-room house around a large center chimney. In 1787, the owner was Silas Grout, who married Susanna Clapp, and they probably added the stone room, which we know, in the back of the building. One of the ways that you can tell that the building wasn't as tall and didn't have that room back there was that the roof, the chimney is farther down on the front. So when they raised the roof to incorporate that back room, they left the chimney there, but the roof had to be higher in order to stretch across to to incorporate that back room. Their daughter, Jerusha Grout, married Newell Hurd, hence the Grout Hurd House, and in 1822, and probably when they made it into a 2-family and added the south side L. Along came an idea of to build a new town hall, which we looked at before, the stick-style town hall. And the chairman of the building committee was Hodijah Brayman, who thought that the site of the Grout Hurd House was ideal for the new town hall. So he arranged to have the Grout Hurd House moved to an area on Old Sudbury Road just north of his own house. By this time, it had passed to Sarah Hurd, and she had 2 daughters who were both school teachers who lived away, and they came home when she was ill, and they eventually stayed here until they passed away on Old Sudbury Road. So the picture on the right and on the left is Cochituate Road, and the picture on the right is of the same house on Old Sudbury Road, and you can see the projecting bay that was added once it was on Old Sudbury Road, and that was added in about 1890. So then it was time to move it. They had to stabilize all the windows, put it up on rollers, and so on the top, you see it on its site, still just getting ready to move. You see it coming down Old Sudbury Road on the bottom left, and then you see it in its place. And it was pushed back farther. It's not exactly where it was. And then remember see how close it is to the road here. And it was pushed back farther on the site when it returned to its home. Another house that was moved is the Goulding House. It was built in about 1700 on a Maynard lot near the northeast corner of Old Sudbury Road and Glezen Lane, right next to the Samuel Stone Noyes House, which you can see just the edge of that in the left top picture, on the right of the left top picture, sorry. It's right, think about this house being built in about 1700. It was right near where the center of town was. It was at the old cemetery. The meeting house was there until 1723. And there were many, many houses in that area. It was also for years after, in the late 18th century, it was right next to the Samuel Noyes cabinet shop. So the Goulding House was moved to Sudbury in 1918 to 26 on Concord Road, north of Mill Village. It's an early restoration that I find very interesting to see the first period dwelling, houses that are built usually before 1720, in its new location with these casement and diamond pane windows, which is what they had up until about 1710, 1720, but which there are no remaining examples of original diamond pane casement windows in Massachusetts. They're all reproductions of what people thought was going on. And this is what people did in 1918 in terms of restoration, or 1920 in terms of restoration. You were taking it back to the old, restoring, not just rehabilitating. The Horace Hurd House was also moved. It was built in Wayland on Cochituate Road, just south of the First Parish Church. And it was moved up to Winthrop Place. This house was built in about 1845 by Horace Hurd on land that was owned by the family. It was a very large tract of land. Horace Hurd is pretty interesting. We keep bumping into him in other parts of town, or other parts of Wayland Center, I should say. He owned the Green store, which we'll look at in a bit, for a long time. He purchased it in 1828, and he was known to be one of the largest taxpayers and largest landholders in Wayland in 1872. He also owned Pequod Inn, which we looked at a few minutes ago, and he was on the Town Hall Construction Committee in 1878, so he was busy. His grandson, Dwight Hurd, moved this house up to Winthrop Place, and the purpose of that was he was also the one in 1899 who developed the subdivision. 1899, who developed a subdivision for all the land that we know today as Winthrop Terrace, Trinity Place. I forget what it is, Trinity Road, Trinity Place, Winthrop Road, and Trinity Place. And eventually that was a really interesting development in and of itself, but this house was moved up there at a much earlier than the construction. The Zechariah Bryant House is on Old Sudbury Road, number 10 Old Sudbury Road, and it was built in 1770 by Zechariah Bryant, who in fact was among the people that answered the call to Lexington and Concord in 1775. The house was actually built a little bit north of here, and around 1875, the owner was none other than Hodijah Brayman, and he moved it south so he could build his new house, which we'll see in a minute. His elaborate stick-style house no longer exists, and it was probably at that time that some of the updating occurred. There is a Palladian window over the center entry, and there was also a wrap porch. The house was moved again back on the lot away from the road, and the barn was completely rebuilt in the early 2000s. It was falling into the ground. In fact, it had a major sag. When you drove by, you could see that it was leaning into the ground. And at some point, the wrap porch was removed. Kirkside, remodeled and repainted. So it started as the hipped roof green store and meeting hall upstairs. It was made from timbers of the fourth meeting house that were dismantled and brought here in 1815. The fourth meeting house was located where the George Smith store is today, where Palin's was, where the chiropractor's office is, about there. The work was done by Jonathan Fisk Hurd and Luther Glezen. They were allowed to build a dwelling house and a store, provided that they made a meeting room for town meetings. So this was an early separation of church and state, long before it was required by law. So when the first parish church was built, it only was built for religious services, and the town meetings were held in the second story of the Green store, which was apparently named for its color. And every time you see it in writing, you see it with a lowercase g and s, so that it wasn't a formal name that was on a billboard or anything. In 1828, as I said before, Horace Hurd had bought the house and called it the Green Store. So it was purchased in 1888 by Willard Austin Bullard and Susan Bennett Bullard. Bullard had been born in Wayland, and he'd spent a lot of time on his grandfather's farm, which was where Sandy Burr is today. He renovated it in the Colonial Revival style. It has wonderful plaques over each window with these Adamesque swags on them. It's just wonderful detail. And the entry porch, the rounded entry porch with the balustrade, second story balustrade, and first story were all added. The dormer and the bracketing on the top of the dormer as well. Just as an aside, Bullard built the house behind, which is on Winthrop Road, for his daughter. And that house is very intact as well. Willard was a banker in Cambridge. He was president of Harvard Trust. And by the turn of the century, he replaced Horace Hurd. He was the largest landowner. This old house featured Kirkside in 1991, and part of the project was paint analysis, hence the gold color that we see today. And we've been very fortunate to have people who are really appreciative of preservation and have taken loving care of the house. The Ebenezer Roby house was next to the library. It was built in about 1725 by Ebenezer Roby. It passed to his son, Dr. Ebenezer Roby, lived here, and he had his office here as well. And then it went to his son, William Roby, and then to Warren Gould Roby, who gave the land for the library. So he is somebody who's very prominent in the history of Wayland. The house burned, this house that we see here, which is a very traditional Georgian house, burned in 1886. And Warren Gould Roby immediately rebuilt it. So we've always thought, until a couple of weeks ago, I thought, that the house was rebuilt as we see it today, and as you see it in the bottom photograph, in this to the right. However, Gene Siaka showed me a photograph just about 2 weeks ago that we think is of the Warren Gould Roby house, and it has a completely different facade. And it was built as a gable front and then expanded into this really elaborate classical revival or colonial revival 5-bay front. And I'm so puzzled. I have no idea what happened. I've talked to the present owners. But if you look at this photograph, it's the same tree. It's the same entry. It's the same fence. The octagonal shaped room to the back with this splayed chimney is the same. The porch on the side is the same. Where did this picture come from? The gable front building with this 2-story bay. It's such a puzzle. And the interesting part is that the lower photograph, the upper photograph on the left is a Warren Gould Roby, Alfred Wayland cutting photograph. The one on the bottom right is a photograph that is in a picture frame on the present owner's table. And she took it out of the frame and found on the back written Mary A, 1893. So he rebuilt this house in 1888. And when did it be, in those 5 years, did he decide he wanted a different facade and a completely different house? Did he turn it? What did he do here? It's such a puzzle. The Mary A is, in all likelihood, Mary Adelaide, who was the niece of Warren Gould Roby, who inherited the house. So I don't know if anybody knows the answer. I'd love to hear it. So here's the 1893 photograph and the present day photograph of the house. And so you can see the resemblance, quite the same. The Lydia Maria Child House, also famous for, not only for Lydia Maria Child, but it's also where Alfred Wayland Cutting lived after the Childs. It was built in about 1830 by William Bemis on a site of the former Maynard House, a former Maynard House. In the 1840s, Lydia Maria Child and her father, Converse Francis, came here. And in 1850, she actually, her father came here in 1840s, and she came in 1850 to take care of him with her husband. She came. They added on to the small 1.5 story cottage in an attempt to house the two households. So what they, the photograph that you see is the add-on. So the original cottage was just the left-hand part of the top picture, the left-hand picture. And then the Childs added on the other parts to the house. And then along came the Cuttings in the 1880s, and it was remodeled by Charles A. Cutting, who by the 1880s had acquired several houses in the area. He owned the Samuel Stone Noyes, he owned the Goulding House, and then he owned this house. He had married a Glezen, and that's how he got to the Samuel Stone Noyes house in 1857, and then the Goulding House, as I said. He added to the Child house the gable end section that's on the far part of the bottom photograph behind the tree, the part that has the gable front projecting ahead of the cape part that was the original house. And then he extended the original house with extending the roof, building it out for a porch, and then you also see the dormer, the very shallow, steeply pitched shed roof dormer that has 3 windows across the front. And so keep an eye on the chimneys of the original house, and they're in the middle of the next house, of the next picture that you see. And then here is the house today. And so we have the gable end piece that they had some damage recently, so I'm sorry that I didn't take it at a better time. You can see the 3 windows that were part of the dormer that got filled in, and the chimneys are still there in the back. They're rebuilt, of course, but they're in the back of the original section, which is the middle section of this picture. On to Mainstone Farm, which purchased in 1872 by William Powell Perkins for $10,000. It was 200 rocky acres, they say, of land and the house and a barn. And in 1874, he enlarged the house with a 3rd story in the Second Empire style, which was popular at the time. And he planted maple trees along Old Connecticut Path and terraced gardens all behind and in front of the house. At that time, the house was oriented towards Old Connecticut Path, and a driveway came in front of it, which is the facade that you see here. And then, as it is today, now the entry is all on the other side. Mansion Inn, we're going to go through a couple of big estates here that were in Wayland that no longer exist. Mansion Inn was built by Michael Simpson of Framingham. He was the owner of the Roxbury Carpet and Saxonville Mills factory. He built this off Old Connecticut Path on Dudley Pond. It was assessed for $12,000 at its when it was new, and it was the highest in Wayland at the time and cost more than $150,000 to build. I'm sorry, the assessment was $12,000. The payment, his taxes, were $12,000. In 1882, he married Evangeline Mars from Wayland, but he died almost immediately. And so in 1884, she remarried and moved to Minnesota. So the house passed on and had many different iterations, and it eventually was known as Mansion Inn. It was a resort and a restaurant and a dance place. And it burned in the 1950s. So what we have left are the Castlegate piers, which again, CPA money was used to restore those. They are on West Plain Street at Castlegate. And I point out to you the H's and the Y's that are in the grout, the way the stones are laid up of the piers on the right. And that was allegedly to recall his grandsons. I mean, yeah, his grandsons, I think, or his sons. I'm sorry, I should know that, who went to Harvard and Yale. And then there were lions in front of the property, and this lion is presently at the Grout Herd House and is wearing a mask, but I did take the mask off so you could see his full face. But I put the mask back on. The Francis Shaw estate was this enormously rich classical revival mansion of 22 rooms. It was built by in 1892, designed by Little and Brown, had a flat roof and a balustrade and projecting piazzas and large projecting central section with columns and pilasters. And it was all reminiscent of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. It formerly laid out gardens near the house and picturesque landscape further away. It was demolished in 1942, and it was on the top of Shaw Drive. And the estate was that Shaw owned encompassed all of the land of between Old Connecticut Path and Cochituate Road, and then all up Woodridge. All that area was there. It had been notable for features, again, that were brought from other places, from the famous Samuel McIntyre staircase that had been removed from the Joseph Barrell mansion in Somerville that was being demolished, and paneling from the Somerset Club that was being relocated or replaced, and then flagstones apparently came from the old State House. We went to go to Greenway, the Payne estate, as we often think of it. Edwin Farnham Green and Charlotte Nichols Green came here in 1909. They purchased 219 acres from Shaw, and they hired Samuel Mead of Cabot, Everett, and Mead, who was the architect. He was the lead architect for our library. Green was the treasurer and CEO of Pacific Mills, and he had many notable connections and guests at Greenway, which he built in 1910. And his guest book is, or their guest book, I should say, is part of the Wayland Historical Society collection. The Paynes bought it in 1926, Frank Cabot Payne and Virginia Marie Lowe of Detroit, and they'd been married in 1916, and they bought this property and owned it until the town was fortunate enough to be able to purchase it. And I include both of these photographs so you can see that they really have preserved an enormous amount of the original building for us to still understand the grand estate that this was. Hodijah Brayman House, which I've mentioned a couple of times, I mentioned him a couple of times. It was built in 1877. It's a large Italianate with stick-style elements, round-headed windows, projecting two-story bay, king posts and trusses. Those are those wood pieces that are in the gable peaks. And on an early 20th century postcard here, it's known as the Hastings House because it was no longer owned by Brayman. Brayman had come to Wayland as a summer resident, married the daughter of Samuel Stone Noyes, and lived in the Noyes house before building this large Victorian house. It was demolished in 1980, and what remains of it are the stone pillars, which are lead to the sidewalk that goes up to the new housing on the old Raytheon site near the town center and on Old Sudbury Road. Other houses that have been demolished, the Jude Damon House that was on Old Sudbury Road, the Morrow Mansion that replaced the Jude Damon House on a similar, right near the site in 1901. And this was another country estate. Somebody was building and having for summertime house to come to. The three-story colonial revival and classical mansion with a flat roof and some federal elements. And then the Luther Gleason House you see on the bottom photograph is a much earlier house. It was built in 1806, and it has the brick ends of his brother who built the house that we had seen in the Seabury book that was eventually owned by the Pattersons, the Abel Glezen house. And it's called it's often referred to as the Folsom House as well, because it's on Folsom Pond, which is named after the 1860s owners, Benjamin Folsom and family. Almost finally, two more. The Wayland Freight House, I show you this because of the difference that paint can make and restoration. This house was this freight house, this building was very lovingly restored with CPA funds. Actual special curved planes were made to make the board and batten siding to replace those parts that had to be replaced. And the paint was a little bit of paint analysis and a little bit of research from various photographs that we had of the freight house and the depot. But it is, in all likelihood, both buildings were painted with this double color scheme of the red on the bottom and the yellow on the top. And this was, again, a CPA funds, I might have said that. And fortunately, it didn't get demolished. And the last one I show you is the Wayland Waterworks Pump House, which is on Rice Pond. It's right off Rice Road, right near the intersection of Woodridge Road. It was built in 1878, very fanciful architecture in this pump house that took water from Rice Pond to Cochituate, particularly to protect the shoe factories against fire. The water source was Snake Brook, and there was a dam at Rice's Pond to carry the water then through the water pipes that were all laid in this area. There was a gatehouse nearby, but the waterworks, the pump house building remains. And so the picture on the left shows you the plaques that are missing, that one has WWW Wayland Waterworks in it. The other one on the other side of the door has 1878, the date. It had a big hip roof with obviously patterned shingles. They were no doubt slate, and on stone it would definitely have been slate. But the polychroming of the multicolored stones are still evident. And then it had this wonderful little ironwork on the top, the fretwork on the top, the peak of the building. In the 1980s, the roof was falling in, as you can see, or 1990s. I might have taken that photograph. I can't remember. I'm sorry. And then the Conservation Commission did ask the DPW to help stabilize it. So, and they didn't put back the hipped roof. They just put on a top to preserve it. It's a gable roof, and it is preserving the building at least. Inside are the original pump house waterworks. It's a 2-level building. Those are below grade, and the rest is above. And so that ends this conversation. And as Annette had said, the slides will be available, and you could just go to the Wayland Museum, Wayland Historical Society and Museum website, and then you'll see it there. The recording will be available as well. Thank you so much. I have to stop sharing so I can see you all. There you go.